Welcome to my kitchen. I'm Claire. I'm 93 years old. And today we are making meals from the Depression.
Cheese, bacon, everything delicious in the world. I hope you get a chance to make this because the smell and the taste are beyond the beyond.
This is seriously the best beef stroganoff, and it comes together so easy. The beef is so tender, the sauce is seasoned to perfection, and I love the thick sliced mushrooms. They're just as meaty as the beef. This is such a treat.
There was a time when every tired man came home to a hot plate that told a story of making do with what you had. Back in the 1980s, cookbooks weren't filled with fancy ingredients or complicated techniques. These were meals born from necessity, crafted in kitchens where every dollar mattered and every plate had to be full. Beef stroganoff. Beef stroganoff wasn't restaurant food back then. It was Thursday night when the paycheck was running thin, but everyone still needed to feel like dinner mattered. You'd hear Mom in the kitchen, that familiar sizzle of chuck roast hitting hot margarine, and you knew tonight was going to be different. The smell would creep through the house, rich, meaty, promising, while she stirred those strips of beef with wooden spoons that had seen 1,000 similar dinners. The onions came next, softening in the same pan until they were golden and sweet, filling the kitchen with the kind of aroma that made homework stop and stomachs start paying attention. Then the mushrooms, not because they were fancy, but because they stretched expensive beef into something that could feed 6 people without anyone leaving the table hungry. Those canned mushrooms turned 1 pound of meat into enough dinner for the whole family, and nobody questioned the math, but it was the sour cream that made everything feel luxurious. Stirred in at the very end, off the heat so it wouldn't curdle, transforming all those separate ingredients into something creamy and rich that coated every grain of those wide egg noodles. The noodles cost pennies, but they did their job, soaking up every bit of that sauce like they understood their purpose in making this meal feel complete. Dad would come home with grease under his fingernails and sawdust in his hair, see the stroganoff bubbling on the stove, and his shoulders would drop an inch. Someone had put in real effort tonight, even when money was tight and easier options were calling. Kids would clean their plates without being asked, and there were always enough leftovers for lunch tomorrow, which somehow tasted even better after all those flavors had spent the night getting acquainted in the refrigerator. This wasn't about impressing anyone. This was about taking a tough day and ending it with something that tasted like caring, served over noodles that understood their job was to make everyone feel full and satisfied, no matter what the bank account looked like. Tater tot hot dish. In Minnesota, kitchens and throughout the Midwest, tater tot hot dish was more than dinner. It was a way of life that understood how to feed a family when every dollar mattered. The sound of that oven door opening after 45 minutes could stop conversations and bring kids running from wherever they'd been hiding. Golden tots on top, bubbling cream sauce underneath, and the promise that tonight nobody would go to bed hungry. The bottom layer was always ground beef, browned until it actually looked brown, instead of that sad gray that happened when you rushed things. Smart cooks seasoned it right in the pan. Salt, pepper, maybe some garlic powder if the budget allowed for extras. The beef mixed with diced onions that had been cooked until they were soft and sweet, creating a foundation that would carry the whole dish through that long bake in the oven. Then came whatever vegetables were on sale or hiding in the back of the freezer. Green beans, corn, mixed vegetables. It didn't matter as long as they added color and helped stretch that pound of ground beef into enough dinner for everyone. The cream of mushroom soup went on next, spread like a blanket over everything, thick and rich and promising to bind all those separate ingredients into something that felt like a real meal. But those tater tots on top, perfectly arranged in rows like little golden soldiers, that's what made it special. Kids would fight over who got the corner pieces where the tots got extra crispy, and adults would find themselves scraping the edges of the casserole dish to get every last bit of that creamy sauce that had bubbled up around the edges. This was church potluck food that worked just as well for Tuesday night dinner. It was Minnesota nice in casserole form, the kind of meal that said, "We take care of each other here. We don't waste anything, and we make sure everyone gets enough." One dish fed the whole family with enough left over for tomorrow's lunch, proving that the best comfort food didn't need fancy ingredients, just the understanding that food was love made visible. Chicken divan. Chicken divan had a way of making yesterday's leftover rotisserie chicken feel like Sunday dinner all over again. The smell of broccoli steaming on the stove, mixed with the sound of that store-bought chicken being pulled apart by hand, creating something that felt like real cooking, even when you were mostly just assembling ingredients that someone else had already prepared. The broccoli had to be just right. Bright green and tender, but not mushy, because it was going to spend time in the oven and you didn't want it falling apart. Smart cooks learned to pull it off the heat while it still had some bite, knowing it would finish cooking under that blanket of cheese and sauce. Into the buttered casserole dish it went, a green foundation that would add color and nutrition to what might otherwise have been just chicken and cheese. The chicken came next, torn into chunks that looked intentional rather than like leftovers you were trying to use up. Rotisserie chicken was perfect for this, already seasoned, already tender, and available at the grocery store for less than you could cook a whole chicken yourself. It didn't matter that you hadn't roasted it in your own oven. What mattered was turning it into something that felt like a planned meal rather than just reheated leftovers. But the sauce was what made everything special. Cream of chicken soup mixed with milk and sour cream, seasoned with just enough salt and pepper to wake up those flavors, then enriched with a generous handful of sharp cheddar cheese. Poured over the chicken and broccoli, it promised to bind everything together into something cohesive and satisfying. The buttery breadcrumbs on top, or crushed Ritz crackers if you were feeling fancy, turned golden brown in the oven while everything underneath heated through and those flavors melded together. 20 minutes later, you had something that looked like you'd been cooking all day, served straight from the casserole dish onto plates that always got scraped clean, with everyone asking if there was enough left for seconds. Hamburger Helper Beef Stroganoff. That little white glove on the box was like a friendly hand reaching out to exhausted parents everywhere. Hamburger Helper changed weeknight cooking forever, and the beef stroganoff flavor was the one that made working mothers everywhere breathe a sigh of relief. Brown a pound of ground beef, dump in the contents of that box, add some milk and water, and 15 minutes later you had something that resembled real stroganoff without any of the fuss. The sound of ground beef hitting the hot pan was immediately recognizable, that aggressive sizzle that meant dinner was happening fast tonight. Kids would start gravitating toward the kitchen, homework forgotten, because they knew the drill. The seasoning packet would come next, along with those flat pasta pieces that looked almost like the real egg noodles from fancy stroganoff, but cooked much faster and held up better to the vigorous stirring that one-pot meals required. The milk made everything creamy. The water provided the liquid needed to cook the pasta, and somehow that little packet of powdered seasonings contained enough flavor magic to make everything taste like someone had been stirring and seasoning for hours. It wasn't the same as homemade stroganoff with real sour cream and fresh mushrooms, but after a 10-hour shift and homework battles, it was close enough. The smell was distinctive. That combination of browning meat and the unique aroma of the seasoning mix that promised comfort and satisfaction were coming soon. You could smell it from the driveway, which meant dinner would be ready by the time everyone washed their hands and found their places around the table. The pasta absorbed all those flavors as it cooked, becoming more than just a vehicle for sauce, turning into something that actually tasted like stroganoff if you didn't think too hard about how it got that way. Was it gourmet? Not even close. Did it fill bellies and keep families fed on countless weeknight dinners when cooking felt impossible? Absolutely. And sometimes, when you were really tired and really hungry, it actually tasted better than the homemade version because it meant someone cared enough to get dinner on the table without making a big production out of it. Porcupine meatballs. Porcupine meatballs were born from the kind of kitchen wisdom that understood how to make a pound of ground beef feed 6 people and still feel like you were serving something special. The name alone was enough to make kids giggle and forget they were eating a meal designed to stretch expensive protein with cheap rice. When those meatballs simmered in tomato sauce, the rice grains poked out like little spikes, giving them their funny name that somehow made dinner feel more fun. The mixing happened in a big bowl, ground beef combined with uncooked rice and diced onions, everything held together with a beaten egg and seasoned with whatever was handy, salt, pepper, maybe some garlic powder if the spice rack was well stocked. The rice wasn't just filler. It was insurance against tough meatballs, absorbing moisture and helping everything stay tender during the long, slow cooking that would transform tough into delicious. You could feel the grains of rice when you rolled the meatballs between your palms, knowing they were going to expand and soften during cooking, creating those characteristic spikes that gave the dish its whimsical name. Into the simmering tomato sauce they went. Sometimes just canned tomato soup thinned with water, sometimes actual tomato sauce if the budget allowed for extras, but always something acidic and rich that would help break down the meat while building flavor. The kitchen filled with the smell of slow simmering comfort, tomatoes and beef and onions all melding together over low heat that couldn't be rushed. The longer they cooked, the more tender they became, and the more the rice absorbed all those savory flavors from the sauce. By dinner time, you had meatballs that were tender enough to cut with a fork, and rice that tasted like it had been planning this flavor combination all along. Served over mashed potatoes or egg noodles, they were comfort food that understood exactly how far a dollar needed to stretch. The sauce was always the best part, rich with the flavors from the meatballs and perfect for soaking up with whatever starch was brave enough to share the plate. Leftovers were even better the next day, making lunch something to look forward to rather than just another reheated meal. Salmon patties with creamed peas. Friday nights often meant salmon patties, not because fish was fancy, but because a can of salmon cost less than $2 and could feed a family of 4. You'd hear the can opener working, that distinctive sound that meant Mom was making something different tonight, something that would turn a humble can of pink fish into golden brown patties that somehow felt more special than they had any right to. The salmon got drained and picked through carefully, looking for any sneaky bones that might have made it through the canning process. Then came the mixing, breadcrumbs that might have been store-bought or might have been made from the heels of the bread loaf, a beaten egg to hold everything together, and diced onions for flavor and texture. Some families added saltine crackers instead of breadcrumbs, which gave a slightly different texture and a hint of salt that made everything taste more intentional. The hot oil in the cast iron skillet was crucial. It had to be just the right temperature to create that immediate sizzle when the patties hit the pan, promising a crispy exterior that would contrast with the tender, flaky interior. You could hear them cooking, that gentle bubbling that meant the coating was getting golden brown while the salmon heated through and all those flavors melded together. The creamed peas were the perfect companion, made by cooking frozen peas in a simple white sauce that was basically just butter, flour, and milk cooked together until smooth and rich. The mild sweetness of the peas balanced the salty richness of the salmon, and together they created something that felt both humble and slightly elegant, like company food made with everyday ingredients. Kids might pick at the peas, but they'd devour those golden brown patties, especially if you served them with a squeeze of lemon juice or a dollop of tartar sauce if the budget stretched that far. Any leftovers made excellent breakfast the next morning, fried up crispy and served alongside scrambled eggs, proving that good food could work for any meal of the day. The whole meal cost less than what a single serving of fish would run at a restaurant, but it filled everyone up and left them feeling like they'd eaten something real and satisfying, which was all that mattered when the paycheck had to stretch until next Friday. Chili Mac. Chili Mac was what happened when the chili pot was running low, but there were still mouths to feed and no money for takeout. Someone, somewhere, had the genius idea to boil up some elbow macaroni and let the thick, meaty chili stretch itself over those little tubes of pasta, turning not quite enough into plenty. The smell that rose from those bowls, rich chili mingling with starchy pasta, was pure comfort born from making do. This wasn't really a recipe as much as it was a solution to the eternal problem of having almost enough of something, but not quite. Sunday's big pot of chili was supposed to last several meals, but families have a way of eating more than you expect, and by Wednesday you might find yourself staring at just enough chili for 3 people when 5 needed dinner. The pasta transformed everything. Those elbow macaroni soaked up the chili flavors, cumin and tomatoes and whatever heat had made it into the original pot, while adding the bulk that turned a small amount of chili into a filling meal. The starch helped mellow any spiciness that might be too intense for kids, while making everything stick to your ribs in the way that only carbohydrates could manage. Sharp cheddar cheese melted on top while everything was still steaming hot, creating this gooey, irresistible mess that nobody could resist. Kids would get chili sauce on their shirts and not care. Dad would go back for seconds with a cold beer, and Mom would feel like she'd pulled off some kind of kitchen magic trick that turned scarcity into abundance. The leftovers were always better than the original because all those flavors had time to get acquainted overnight, melding together into something that tasted like it had been planned all along, rather than thrown together from whatever was available. Reheated the next day with a little extra cheese on top, it became a completely different dish that was somehow exactly what everyone wanted to eat again. Chicken a la king over biscuits. Chicken a la king was how you turned yesterday's leftover chicken into something that felt like a special occasion. The sound of butter melting in the pan, followed by the gentle whisking of flour into that golden fat, promised that something creamy and rich was coming together. This was restaurant-quality comfort food made with whatever chicken was left from Sunday's dinner, transformed into something that looked like you'd been planning this meal all week. The white sauce was where technique mattered, but it was technique that any working mother could master with practice. Butter, flour, and milk cooked together until smooth and thick, with just enough seasoning to wake up those flavors without overwhelming the mild chicken. The key was patience. Rushing the sauce meant lumps, and nobody wanted lumpy gravy on their biscuits when they were trying to make leftovers feel elegant. The chicken went in next, diced into bite-sized pieces that would distribute evenly through the creamy sauce. Leftover roasted chicken was perfect for this, already seasoned and tender, just needing to be warmed through rather than cooked again. Frozen peas added color and a little sweetness, while diced carrots provided crunch and nutrition that made the whole plate look intentional and balanced. Split biscuits made the perfect base, fluffy, buttery platforms that could soak up that rich sauce without falling apart. Whether they were from scratch or from a can didn't matter. What mattered was having something substantial enough to make this feel like a complete meal rather than just creamy chicken soup served in a bowl. The finished dish looked like something you might order at a nice restaurant, but it cost a fraction of what eating out would run and used up ingredients that might otherwise have become just another sandwich, served hot from the stove, with that creamy sauce pooling around the edges of the biscuits. It proved that the best comfort food came from understanding how to make something special from whatever you already had. Beef and noodle casserole. Beef and noodle casserole was the answer when you needed to feed everyone, but weren't sure exactly how you were going to make it happen. Ground beef, egg noodles, whatever vegetables were hiding in the freezer, and a can of cream soup to bind it all together, assembled in one dish and baked until everything melded into something greater than the sum of its parts. The smell that came from the oven during that final 20 minutes was pure reassurance that dinner was handled. The beauty was in how forgiving it was. Didn't have cream of mushroom soup. Cream of chicken worked fine. No ground beef. Ground turkey was cheaper and nobody complained. The vegetables could be anything. Frozen mixed vegetables, leftover green beans from last night, even canned corn drained and stirred in for sweetness and color. The noodles absorbed all those flavors while they baked, becoming more than just a starch filler. You could hear the casserole bubbling in the oven during those last few minutes, the cheese on top getting golden and slightly crispy, while everything underneath heated through and those flavors melded together. Kids loved how everything came together in one dish. No separate vegetables to negotiate, no sides to finish before getting dessert. It was all mixed up together, covered in melted cheese, and served hot from the oven. The ground beef layer was where smart cooks added flavor beyond just salt and pepper. A packet of onion soup mix could transform plain ground beef into something with real depth, while proper browning created the kind of rich, caramelized flavors that made the whole dish taste more expensive than it actually was. Gray, steamed ground beef never contributed much to any meal, but properly browned meat with good color added richness to everything it touched. Leftovers reheated beautifully, often tasting even better the next day after all those flavors had time to get properly acquainted. One casserole dish fed the whole family, with enough left over for lunch tomorrow, proving that the best weeknight meals were the ones that understood how to stretch ingredients and effort across multiple meals. Sloppy Joes. Sloppy Joes answered the eternal weeknight question of how to make 1 pound of ground beef feed everyone without anyone leaving the table unsatisfied. The sound of that meat hitting the hot pan, followed by the sweet smell of brown sugar and ketchup simmering together, promised that tonight was going to be messy and delicious and completely unpretentious. The name was honest. These were definitely sloppy, and that was exactly the point. Brown that meat with some diced onions until everything was properly caramelized and smelling like dinner, then add ketchup for sweetness, brown sugar for depth, and Worcestershire sauce for that umami complexity that made everything taste more grown up. The mixture needed to simmer until it was thick enough to pile on hamburger buns without running off the sides, but not so thick that it felt like eating meatloaf filling. The beauty was in how simple it was. Most of the ingredients were pantry staples that you could keep on hand for exactly these kinds of weeknight emergencies when cooking felt impossible, but everyone still needed to eat something substantial. The whole meal could be on the table in 20 minutes, which made it perfect for those nights when homework and bedtime were competing with empty stomachs. Kids who normally turned their noses up at regular hamburgers would devour sloppy joes, probably because the sweet tangy sauce made everything taste like a treat rather than just another dinner. The messiness was part of the appeal. Everyone needed extra napkins, everyone got sauce on their fingers, and somehow that made dinner feel more relaxed after a day of trying to keep everything neat and proper. The smell alone could bring everyone to the dinner table. That combination of browning beef, sweet ketchup, and tangy Worcestershire created an aroma that said comfort food was happening. No fancy ingredients required. Served on soft hamburger buns with potato chips and maybe some pickles on the side, it was a meal that satisfied without pretending to be anything more sophisticated than it was. Liver and onions. Liver and onions was not about pleasure. It was about nutrition and economy working together in the practical way that defined so much of working-class cooking. The smell hit you the moment you walked in the house, thick, unmistakable, filling every corner with an aroma that made kids start negotiating before they even sat down. This was dinner that reminded you that food was medicine first, comfort second. The preparation was straightforward, but required understanding. The liver got sliced thin and soaked in milk to draw out some of that strong mineral flavor that made it so polarizing. Then it was dusted with seasoned flour and fried quickly in hot fat. Bacon grease, if you had it. vegetable oil if you didn't. The key was not overcooking it, which would make it tough and even stronger in flavor than it already was. But those onions, sliced thick and cooked slow until they were golden brown and caramelized, that's what made the whole thing bearable. They provided the sweetness that balanced the intensity of the liver, cooking in the same pan to pick up all those flavors while contributing their own gentle, mellowing influence. Smart cooks knew that those onions were the bridge between nutrition and palatability. This came from a generation that had lived through the Depression and understood that you didn't waste any part of an animal. Liver was loaded with iron and B vitamins, cost less than any other protein at the butcher shop, and whether you liked it or not was beside the point. It was good for you, especially for kids who needed iron for growing bodies and parents who needed strength for hard work. Dads who grew up during lean times remembered when liver was a luxury, something you were grateful to have on your plate. Kids in the 1980s saw it as punishment, but they ate it because you didn't get dessert otherwise, and those sweet caramelized onions actually made it taste pretty good if you didn't think too hard about what you were chewing. Served with mashed potatoes to soak up the pan juices, it was a meal that taught you that life wasn't always sweet, but it was always worth pushing through. Tuna noodle casserole. When the pantry was looking sparse and payday was still 3 days away, tuna noodle casserole was the dish that could rescue any weeknight. The sound of that can opener working on 2 cans of tuna, followed by the familiar routine of boiling egg noodles and heating up cream of mushroom soup, promised that dinner was happening even when it felt like there wasn't much to work with. This was comfort food built on ingredients that could sit in your pantry indefinitely until you needed them. Canned tuna kept forever. Egg noodles were cheap and filling. Cream soup provided richness without requiring any sauce-making skills, and frozen peas added color and nutrition without much expense. The whole thing could be assembled in one dish and baked until bubbly, transforming simple ingredients into something that actually felt like a planned meal. The key was in the proportions. Enough soup to make everything creamy without being soupy, enough tuna to feel substantial without overwhelming the mild flavors, and enough noodles to soak up all those flavors while providing the carbohydrates that made the meal filling. The peas could go in frozen. They'd cook through in the oven without becoming mushy or losing their bright green color. But that topping, crushed potato chips or buttered breadcrumbs, was what transformed simple casserole into something special. The chips provided salty crunch that contrasted with the creamy interior, while breadcrumbs gave a more sophisticated finish that made the whole dish look intentional rather than thrown together. Either way, that golden, crispy layer on top made all the difference. The smell that came from the oven during those last few minutes of baking was pure reassurance. Bubbling cream sauce and toasted breadcrumbs, promising that even when the refrigerator was nearly empty, you could still put something satisfying on the table that would leave everyone feeling fed and cared for. Hamburger rice skillet. 1 pound of ground beef, 1 cup of rice, and whatever else you could find in the pantry. This was dinner that happened entirely in a single skillet when washing dishes felt like the last straw after a long day. The sound of beef hitting hot oil, followed by the gentle sizzle of rice toasting in those savory drippings, promised something filling and comforting without a sink full of dirty pots to deal with afterward. The technique was borrowed from fancier cooking, toasting the rice in fat before adding liquid, but adapted for the reality of weeknight dinners when technique had to serve efficiency. Every grain got coated with those beef drippings, which meant every bite would taste like more than just plain rice. The onions softened in the same pan, adding sweetness and depth that made the whole dish taste more complex than its simple ingredient list suggested. Canned tomatoes provided both flavor and some of the liquid needed to cook the rice, while beef broth, or even just bouillon dissolved in water, added richness that made everything taste more intentional. The key was getting the ratio right. Too much liquid, and you'd end up with soup. Too little, and the rice would be crunchy and undercooked. But get it right, and you had something that satisfied both hunger and the need for comfort. Smart cooks added frozen vegetables in the last few minutes. Corn, peas, green beans, whatever was hiding in the freezer. This turned simple rice and beef into something that looked and tasted like a complete meal, with colors that made parents feel good about what they were serving, and flavors that made kids clean their plates without being asked. The whole thing cooked in 20 minutes, start to finish, in one pan that could go from stovetop to table without any fuss. It was efficiency and flavor working together to create something that understood exactly what busy families needed. Food that was filling, satisfying, and didn't create more work than it solved. Stuffed bell peppers. Stuffed bell peppers made individual dinner presentations out of everyday ingredients, turning ground beef and rice into something that looked like you'd put in way more effort than you actually had. The peppers stood up straight in the baking dish like little green soldiers, each one a personal casserole that made everyone feel special, even when dinner was basically just leftovers dressed up in vegetable costumes. The preparation felt almost ceremonial, cutting the tops off those peppers, scooping out all the seeds and white membrane, creating hollow vessels that would hold whatever mixture you'd managed to put together. Ground beef mixed with cooked rice, diced onions for flavor, and whatever seasonings were handy, all bound together with a beaten egg that would help everything hold its shape during baking. The peppers themselves added vegetables to the meal without any negotiation from picky eaters. They were essentially edible serving bowls, softening in the oven until they were tender but still held their shape, contributing their own mild, slightly sweet flavor that complemented the savory filling without overwhelming it. Each person got their own pepper, which somehow made dinner feel more special than just scooping casserole onto plates. Kids felt important having their own individual meal, while adults appreciated the built-in portion control that helped stretch 1 pound of ground beef into enough dinner for 6 people. A little cheese on top during the last few minutes of baking created that golden, bubbly finish that made everything look intentional and appealing. The leftovers reheated beautifully, and any extra filling could be served over regular rice for anyone who didn't want to deal with the pepper itself. It was presentation and practicality working together, proving that sometimes the best way to make simple ingredients feel special was to serve them in a way that made everyone feel like they were getting their own personal meal. A beef stew with dumplings. When cheaper cuts of meat needed time to become tender and the weather outside made you crave something that would warm you from the inside out, beef stew was the answer that filled the house with promise long before dinner was actually ready. The sound of chuck roast sizzling in batches, followed by the gentle bubbling that would continue for hours, meant someone was taking the time to transform tough into tender through patience and low heat. This was slow cooking before anyone had heard of slow cookers, the kind of meal that simmered on the stovetop all afternoon while life happened around it. The browning step was crucial. You couldn't crowd the meat or it would steam instead of sear, and you needed that caramelization to build the deep, rich flavors that would carry the whole pot through hours of cooking. The vegetables went in at different stages depending on how long they took to cook. Onions early to develop sweetness and build the flavor base, potatoes and carrots later so they wouldn't fall apart from overcooking. The kitchen filled with the smell of slow simmering comfort, that deep, rich aroma that built anticipation for dinner while promising that something really good was developing in that pot. But the dumplings were what turned simple stew into something extraordinary. Basic biscuit dough dropped by spoonfuls into that simmering liquid where they cooked up light and fluffy while absorbing all those rich flavors. The trick was not lifting the lid while they cooked. They needed steady steam to rise properly, and patience was the only ingredient that couldn't be substituted. By dinner time, those tough, cheap cuts had become fork tender. The vegetables had melted into a rich, thick broth, and those dumplings had transformed humble stew into something something that felt like a feast. One pot fed the whole family with enough left over for tomorrow's lunch, proving that the best comfort food came from understanding that time and technique could make anything delicious.